let's get some analysis. Let's bring in political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, thank you so much for your time. So, I mean, just listening to what Nhlanhla had to say, at this point in time, we're not really sure if those proceedings have indeed started. We saw that ANC in its media statement, essentially asking for space as it conducts this virtual hearing. I mean, the issue, of course, is why it took so long. I mean, there was the safety concern issue, we know, before the elections. But just give us your take around this long-standing matter and perhaps your view in terms of the possible outcome.
Good afternoon and good afternoon to the viewers. I think you're right in many ways. It's a very prickly issue for the ANC. The time frame within which they've responded to the implications that this has in terms of their own constitution regarding what has transpired since former President Jacob Zuma had announced in December 2023, where he had noted in that speech or the letter that he had written to say that he doesn't feel that he can vote for the ANC. He didn't really say, in my opinion, and I think we have to go back and also reread and re-look at that speech where he made that note about how does he feel about this ANC, and that I think is a core question. He doesn't refer to the ANC in its entirety. He specifically refers to the Ramaphosa ANC, and that has been a byline for all of the MK party, including the spokesperson. When you listen to them in Parliament now, when you listen to their responses to the ANC, they talk about it in a very kind of particular fashion. So I think for the ANC, what we are seeing is again that question of how they want to deal with the issue, particularly from an optics level, but also in terms of the fact that, as the reporter had indicated, this question about whether you can have this disciplinary hearing face-to-face, or do you want it virtually? And that has been the agitation, I think, in terms of what does a physical presence mean? How does that impact on both the ANC as a party, which has basically, feeling the heat from the election. Before the election, they were very conscious about the security implications, the impact that this would have. Post the election, I think it still remains a core question, a core consideration for them. And I think that is possibly where we are now. So the question is really, if it's a virtual meeting, if the meeting is carried on as per the ANC press statement released earlier today, the question would be is former President Jacob Zuma on that virtual platform? Has he, turned on his video, gone on to whatever platform they're using for this virtual DC hearing, and seeing to what extent it's being ventilated in that way? And I think this is again something that is perhaps linked back to the optics of what this means for the MK party. I think that optics is very important to be there physically, because that can also represent a very important avenue in terms of how the MK party has utilized the spaces and the platforms outside of court hearings where they've been successful, how they've tried to address the narrative through a physical space, and all of that kind of gives them that ventilation, gives them that kind of optics in terms of how they control that narrative and how they present that narrative from a physical perspective. So having a virtual meeting, I think, also creates this kind of optics around whether or not the ANC, as per the DC, are willing to have that kind of face-to-face engagement.
And just very quickly, just to touch on something else, that my colleague Nhlanhla had touched on, just the magnitude of this moment, I think, also needs to be said, for both former President Jacob Zuma as well as the ANC. I mean, this is, of course, a long-serving and a very senior leader within the party itself. And just coming out of this election, as you said, the ANC feeling that much heat, both internally and I would imagine its position in the country. Just talk about, that symbolism of this particular moment that we are finding ourselves in.
We've never been here before where a former president has been brought before a hearing of this nature. So that's firstly the one question or the one issue of the symbolism. Secondly, I think you can't ignore the stature of former President Zuma, particularly along the lines of how he has presented himself as a liberation struggle stalwart, a person who, in his many interviews before the election, and even when he was president for his one-term and truncated second term, you find that it's always about the kind of liberation struggle ethics and morality that he feels he brought to it. And so what you're seeing now is, for a leader who has served in the way that he has articulated his identity as a struggle stalwart, as somebody who cannot in good conscience, as he quotes, vote for this ANC that has in his mind betrayed some of those dynamics, I think comes back to the optics. It also comes back to the fact that he is a very contested figure. You either love him or you hate him, or you find that you're taken in by his charisma. I think there's a lot that happens as a person who puts out his feelings in a very interesting public way. So I think at that level, this is something unprecedented as well, because previously, where you do have, perhaps looking at the way in which COPE emerged out of the ANC after the 2008 recall of the former President Mbeki, I think you also have to think about, did it have that kind of moment? So I think it's very symbolic in terms of the kind of unprecedented nature the ANC is finding itself in.
Yeah, unprecedented. And as some say, there's only one outcome, and that is a dismissal. But very quickly, before I let you go, Sanusha, I want to just touch on what's happening tomorrow. We understand, of course, that it's all systems go for the opening of Parliament, where President Ramaphosa will then outline the priorities of the 7th administration, which is key.
Absolutely, and I think the Cabinet Lekgotla over the last several days over the weekend kind of intimated a lot about what are some of the key drawing downs that need to happen. I think economic reform is top of the agenda, getting the economy to at least in a modicum try to find its growth trajectory, depending how the economic reforms are going to happen, looking at the electricity question and making sure that we move towards a stable grid, even if it's about dealing with reckless and errant municipalities, which the electricity minister made note of, in terms of now we having a shift in the terminology from load shedding to load reduction, however that's going to be applied, and then talking about nuclear energy. So there's a lot that's going to happen about how do you get this economy back to perhaps some kind of relative ability to grow, and what that growth would mean in terms of job creation. But again, I think it's also about finding the fit in terms of how Parliament, as a key actor now in this 7th administration of the GNU, would work in the context of its oversight and work with the executive. So it's not necessarily something that's going to happen overnight, but it's something that needs to be expedited. And of course, the working of the 7th administration would be key to looking at the first 100 days in office. And then I think for me, whilst we have this state of the opening of Parliament addressed by the President of the GNU of the 7th administration, what will be key is to go back to what were some of the things that will be mentioned tomorrow as some of the key directives, priorities, and focus areas in terms of getting down to some of the key operationalization of this administration in delivering on policy implementation, etc., working with partners, whether it's in NEDLAC and labor and business, and bringing in the private sector on electricity, water, and transport. But to basically come back in 2025 when the president delivers his first address of the 7th administration after several months in power.
Sanusha, thank you so much for your time. Political analyst Sanusha Naidu there, just weighing in on what we are currently, of course, witnessing in as far as that disciplinary hearing is concerned against President Zuma, and of course just touching on what we are likely to see in the opening of Parliament